It is fundraising. Is it fundraising or is it corruption? Thanks to an unprecedented operation that's putting pressure on companies who do business with the government to pay up. Companies like SoftBank, Apple, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, they're all writing checks for millions thanks to pressure from the president, who checks in with his top fundraiser, Meredith O'Rourke, almost nightly for a list of who's writing checks and who isn't and instructions to ask for more. And in her calls with these donors, she calls Trump, quote, the boss, saying, quote, the boss wants this money. All of this, according to the Wall Street Journal sources who have talked to Miss O'Rourke themselves. Joe Walsh and Chuck Rocha are back with us. So, Joe, to you first. I mean, when you look at the scope and the involvement of the president when it comes to getting these checks written, to putting pressure on all of these big companies, asking for this money to go towards, you know, projects and fundraising, I mean, where is Congress?
Laura, I sound like a broken record because I've been saying for the past 18 months, this is what America looks like without a legislative branch. We don't have a Congress. We haven't had a Congress from the moment Trump was sworn in, which, by the way, is in my long list of dreams. If the Democrats take back control of the House, what are they going to begin to investigate? They should start, Laura, with this. They should start with this president's corruption. Open, naked, obscene public corruption at a level we've never seen. Your question at the top, is this fundraising or... No, it's not fundraising. This is the government pressuring the president, pressuring companies who do business with the government to pay up by millions and millions. This alone should be investigated, and we're not even talking about the billions that Trump has put in his pockets using his office. This is just obscene public corruption.
And we went through the companies that have given this money, that have donated this money, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon. But I also want to talk about where this money is going. SoftBank donated $50 million to Trump's presidential library. Apple cut a check for around $25 million toward his White House ballroom project, Chuck. So have you been talking to Democrats about whether or not they're already trying to investigate this? Is this something that you also think voters are paying attention to and caring about? Because when I was recently in Pennsylvania, I was a little bit surprised that I didn't hear from many voters talking about the money, the private donations going to these pet projects of the president.
And Laura, you're leaving out one important fact that we can add on to what this good reporting is out there right now on the corruption, which is the unlimited amount of money that's going into Trump's super PAC. Folks can write unlimited money now because of the Supreme Court into a super PAC. And folks are asking me, Chuck, what's the difference between this election cycle and how many Democrats are going to win compared to 2018, the first midterms after his first election? Because folks are trying to draw those comparisons. The biggest difference is Donald Trump now has a super PAC that has taken unlimited corporate money, unlimited personal money. Folks can write unlimited checks. And it's almost at $400 million that he can spend now on midterm elections to influence that. You double that down with Elon Musk, your network reporting yesterday, $100 million saying he's going to put that in on top of Trump's. This is where you have folks literally trying to buy elections where the average Joe out there can just show up and vote while he's trying to be influenced by all of this money that's just pouring into the system.
And when we talk about this massive fundraising, this unprecedented fundraising that the Wall Street Journal has been reporting, Trump has raised over $800 million since returning to office. And I should just note that the White House referred questions about all of this to Danielle Alvarez. She said that the president is the, quote, most successful fundraiser in modern political history, adding that one thing has never changed. President Trump can't be bought. That's Danielle Alvarez. Joe, I mean, your response to that, but also, I mean, when the president is, one thing we hear from Republicans all the time is that, well, it's out in the open, so it can't be corruption. What do you say to that?
Laura, you're right, and they say that to me often, which again, it's out in the open. This is really important. Trump is openly corrupt, like we've never seen, but it is out in the open. Why is he doing that? Again, it goes back to what we said a moment ago. Trump does all of this out in the open because he knows Congress won't do a damn thing about it, and he doesn't believe voters care about it. Chuck's more the master than I am, but if I'm a Democrat running for office this cycle, man, I'm pointing a finger at every dollar going into Trump's pocket, every dollar going into Trump's super PAC, and how I'm doing out here when I go to the grocery store. I think, Laura, it's that disconnect, and I even hear that from some of the most hardcore MAGA voters who are confused by Trump's corruption. They want to give him a break, but they always say, but you know, I'm struggling out here too. That's the money play. That's what Democrats have to pitch.
And we'll see if that kind of pitch is ultimately successful come November. Joe Walsh and Chuck Rocha, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Up next, who a top DHS official is calling the worst of the worst and why it's raising serious safety concerns. Worst of the worst. That is what James Percival, a senior Trump administration official in the Department of Homeland Security, is calling sitting federal district judges whose rulings he doesn't like. He's name-checking them on social media over their immigration-related rulings the Trump administration disagrees with, at a time when threats against judges are escalating. And that phrase, the worst of the worst, you've probably heard it before, because Percival is borrowing that from the department's description of undocumented immigrants who have committed serious crimes. Joining us, former chief judge for the U.S. Middle District of Pennsylvania, appointed by President George W. Bush, John Jones III. He's currently the president of Dickinson College. Judge Jones, thank you so much for joining us. Just your reaction, first off, to this DHS, this administration official posting judges' names.
Well, he's not only, Laura, name-checking them, but he's also showing their pictures on the website. And he's also showing a picture of my good friend, Esther Salas, who's a judge, as you know, in New Jersey, who lost her only child, her son, shot by an assailant a couple of years ago. This is really, my view, beyond the pale. And I guess Mr. Percival missed the hearing a couple of weeks ago with Justices Kagan and Coney Barrett, who, as you just said, indicated that the threat level is higher than it has ever been for judges and for justices. So we're not operating in a vacuum here. I think it's just absolutely beyond the pale what Mr. Percival is doing. This isn't about the First Amendment. This is about endangering judges and their families.
And James Percival, I should say, is the general counsel of the Department of Homeland Security, and it's stunning that someone who is in that position is doing this. And you mentioned Judge Salas, Judge Esther Salas, a federal judge who did talk to the Huffington Post recently about this. And she said that I am living proof of the danger. My son isn't here because someone disagreed with the way I was handling a case in court. Judge Jones, are you worried? Do you think it's a realistic concern and worry that this could happen again, that a judge's family member could be killed, or that a judge themselves could be killed?
Well, I've said that frequently, Laura, that I think we're going to get a judge killed, very sadly. I spent 2 terms by appointment of Chief Justice Roberts on the Committee for Judicial Security. I understand these issues. And I can tell you that in the last year, over a quarter of sitting federal judges have had active threats against them. And, you know, they don't have the kind of protection that the Supreme Court of the United States has. I know we're affording them a certain level of protection, but those 2 justices testified in front of Congress and said these judges need to be protected. This is absurd, really. I think Mr. Percival obviously must be bucking for a higher job within the administration. And, you know, for once, I would wish that some members of Congress would stand up and show some courage and talk about these things, because they're getting some threats too. You know, this toxic environment becomes viral. So it's not just judges. I mean, this is the climate that we're in, the unfortunate climate that we're in, but I'm not seeing any particular courage in terms of people talking about this.
The silence is pretty deafening when there's hundreds of threats to judges since October. There have been 534 federal investigations into 383 threats against 286 judges since October. What can judges do? You said that they don't have the same protections as the justices on the Supreme Court. So what actually can judges do to protect themselves and their family members?
Well, we school up judges on ways to avoid putting themselves at risk. But quite frankly, you know, there's only so much you can do. I was threatened on a number of occasions when I was on the bench for almost 20 years. And if you have a threat that is deemed serious enough by the U.S. Marshals, they drop a detail on you and you have 24/7 protection. But you can't protect every judge the way the Supreme Court justices very appropriately have their own police, have constant details. But, you know, when you get somebody like Justice Coney Barrett saying that, you know, she got swatted at her home, had to wear a bulletproof vest, what are we doing here? You know, and that's what I said earlier, or why I said earlier, that, you know, we need leaders to have the courage to speak up and to talk about this. You know, John F. Kennedy said that his book, Profile in Courage, was notably short. And I'm afraid we're in that era again. This isn't, I repeat, something about Mr. Percival exercising his constitutional rights. This is grandstanding in a way that actually puts people at risk of their lives. And it absolutely needs to stop. And he'll probably put my picture up, by the way, too. You know, but to equate this with common criminals and people that the DHS is hunting down, come on. I mean, don't we have a higher obligation as an employee, a highly placed employee of the federal government, than to do things like this?
What are we doing here? That is a good question.
Yep.
Judge John Jones, thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Up next, the demand for justice after President Trump pardoned 2 police officers convicted for covering up a murder. Last year, President Trump pardoned 2 Metropolitan Police officers who were charged and convicted in the death of D.C. resident Carolyn Hilton Brown, who was hit by a car during a lengthy police chase. The officers attempted to hide details of what happened, even turning off their body cameras. When asked about the pardons, Trump called the victim, quote, illegal. But she was actually a U.S. citizen. In the 4th installment of Justice Interrupted, MS Now's Ken Delanian investigated the pardons.
What the bro?
It was a police chase that ended in a death.
Are you good? No, he bleeding heavy.
On an October night in 2020, Karan Hilton was on a moped, pursued by officers in Washington, D.C., who say they suspected him of a crime. The lengthy chase through residential streets ended when Karan drove into the path of an oncoming minivan. He died hours later. Body-worn cameras show what happened next.
Bleeding too much.
While my baby was laying on the ground, blood is gushing out of his head. They're checking his pockets. You understand that? No one is attending to my child.
After the incident, the officers denied that a chase had occurred and attempted to hide details of what happened, at one point even turning off their body-worn cameras.
This was a murder and a cover-up.
Ahmed Bassett prosecuted the 2 officers, Terrence Sutton and Andrew Zabowski. After Bassett began investigating, a different story emerged.
This was treated as an ordinary traffic fender bender accident by Sutton and Zabowski, who took control of the scene. Basically, they told the car that had hit Mr. Brown to leave within 20 minutes, and so that was a piece of evidence that drove away.
Are you guys good?
Witnesses who were trying to provide information about what they saw and heard were told to shoot, and no witness statements were taken.
Everything I'm speaking is straight facts.
Prosecutors concluded the officers had no legal reason to pursue Hilton and therefore helped cause his death. In 2022, a federal jury convicted Sutton of second-degree murder and both officers of obstruction of justice. And in 2024, a judge sentenced them to 5 and 4 years in prison, respectively.
I was happy for Mr. Hilton's 6-month-old to grow up without him was a travesty. And so to be able to give them some modicum of justice, to give the community some modicum of justice was a relief.
The relief was short-lived. Yes, sir. 2 days after he freed January 6th defendants who assaulted police officers, President Trump granted Sutton and Zabavsky full pardons, casting aside the jury's findings. Neither officer had spent a day in prison. And when Trump was asked about why he did it, he didn't appear to understand the case.
They were arrested, put in jail for 5 years because they went after an illegal, and I guess something happened where something went wrong, and they arrested the 2 officers and put them in jail for going after a criminal.
But Karan Hilton was a U.S. citizen. The pardons outraged the community, resulting in protests. In Northwest D.C., Karan's friends don't feel justice was served.
You pardon the killer, you get what I'm saying? You pardon the person that took a child's life, somebody's son, somebody's brother.
And what message do you fear that the pardon of these 2 individuals sends?
I think there's 2 implications that jump out. One is that if you are law enforcement in this country, you can operate above the law. The second is you really see what the corruptive nature of a pardon is.
Lawyers for the officers say the case never should have been brought and would have been overturned on appeal. They say Hilton was a known gang member with a long arrest record and that officers had good reason to stop him. The officers are now suing the Justice Department, alleging malicious prosecution.
So calling it a murder and a cover-up is absurd. There have been many instances over the years, unfortunately, where police pursuits result in accidents. It has never been charged as a crime before, much less murder.
As for their pardons, neither of the officers would have qualified under what the DOJ manual states is an important consideration: acceptance of responsibility, remorse, and atonement. And the pardons have had profound consequences, against the recommendations of the department's own Disciplinary Review Board. Just 2 months later, D.C. Police Chief Pamela Smith reinstated Sutton with a 25-day suspension, while Zabavsky was allowed to retire after paying a $2,500 fine. The D.C. Auditor's report called the actions extremely lenient, saying they undermine the accountability and transparency that are so important for any major city police department in maintaining trust with the community. For Karan's mom, it was a betrayal, not only of her.
If someone kills your child, will you want them to babysit your child, your next child, or any child?
But of the city where she still lives.
I live my life in this country, and everything that I want, I worked, I lived for, was taken from me. I can't see my child. I go home empty.
Ken Delanian, MS Now, Washington.
Our thanks to Ken Delanian for that report. Sit tight. The Moment continues after a quick break.
Russia was a hoax. It was developed by Hillary Clinton and a group of people, small group around a kitchen table, as a way of explaining why she lost an election that a lot of people thought she would win, because the Democrats have an advantage in elections because of a lot of things, aside from the fact they cheat like hell.
Good to be with you. I'm Laura Barone Lopez in for Katie Tur. That was President Trump in 2022, repeating his claim that the Russia investigation was a hoax and alleging Hillary Clinton was behind it. For the record, the Mueller investigation found that Russia did interfere in the 2016 election, but it did not establish a criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. And there is no evidence that Hillary Clinton or her campaign was involved in launching the investigation. In fact, when President Trump sued Hillary Clinton, the DNC and others in 2022, accusing them of creating a false narrative that he colluded with Russia to rig the election, it was rejected. And in November, a conservative appeals upheld that ruling and ordered Trump and his attorney, Alina Habba, to pay nearly $1 million in sanctions, writing that many of their arguments were, quote, frivolous. But President Trump isn't giving up. He isn't stopping there. And he's filing, in a filing made public this week, he said he plans to ask the Supreme Court to reverse the ruling. And it doesn't stop with the 2016 election. He also plans to ask the court to revive a failed defamation lawsuit against CNN over the network's use of the phrase big lie to describe his false claims about the 2020 election. They are just the latest examples of a president desperate to relitigate past elections as he and his administration continue to sow doubt ahead of the midterms, claiming without evidence that millions of non-citizens will vote and that mail-in ballots are inherently corrupt. And in what looks like an effort to ensure he is not blamed if Republicans lose. Joining us, Nevada Secretary of State Francisco Aguilar. He's also the chair of the Democratic Association of Secretaries of State. Secretary Aguilar, thank you so much for joining us. So first up, on these accusations of non-citizens voting in particular, you sent a letter to DHS Secretary Mullen asking about what basis they have for any of their recent claims that nearly 16,000 non-citizens could be registered to vote in Nevada. What information are you asking for? What's your response to these claims from the administration?
First of all, we're asking for basic information. We just want to know the methodology of how they came to the conclusion of this number. We want to see the data. Again, this administration has failed on so many levels to deliver for the American people. And they're trying to distract the American people to these issues that people are tired of hearing about. These issues have been, as you mentioned, these issues have been litigated over 70 times in the courts. They've been litigated in the court of public opinion, but they continue to go back to them because they're trying to distract from their failed decisions to drive America forward.
And just to be clear, the president and his administration have lost repeatedly in court when they've been trying to get information from states, be it your voter rolls, so they can screen it through a federal database and try to figure out if any of the people registered are non-citizens. They've also lost in a number of other areas as they try to get more control over elections. But is winning even the point here? What is the effect of all of their attempts to try to gain more control over state elections?
Well, secretaries are on the front lines of these issues. We are continuing to push back. We are winning litigation. And I'll speak in terms of the president speaks. It's about winners and losers. And the secretaries are winners in this situation. We are winning the courts. I think the litigation over the disclosure of voter rolls and the private information, we're at 16 and up. That's a good record to have, and I'll take that record any single day. On the other litigation over the executive orders, we continue to win. We won a recent appeal, which is now appealing to the Supreme Court. But again, we are on the right side of the law. We will continue to be on the right side of the law. But when they start to talk about these issues, what they're doing is instilling fear. 26 is a critical election to 2028 presidential election. The reason why it's so critical is because when Secretary of States are going to be elected to their positions to administer the 28 presidential. And right now, it's hard to get America's attention to focus on the importance of Secretaries of State. We need support. We need resources to win these battles because we are not running against the MAGA focused candidates in our local states. We're running against this administration, and we need the resources to be able to push back.
I think states are actually 18-0 by our count in terms of not handing over that voter data. But, Secretary, one of the fears that I keep hearing from other election officials is if the chain of custody is broken when it comes to ballots, if somehow federal agents come in, they get a judicial warrant and are able to take these ballots or tabulation machines before there's any kind of certification. How are you prepared to respond to that?
There's a multiple approach. One is making sure that the counties understand what they need to do when a federal agent shows up at a polling location or election center. That is critical, is making sure that they respond in a calm, collective way so that we can be orderly in our response. The second is immediate legal action. I call this our Mad Libs of legal filings. We have the legal pleadings ready to go. We just need the plaintiff and the defendant and the jurisdiction in which we are going to file. We have to be prepared for when this occurs. We can't take it for granted that things are going to go well. As secretaries of state and local elections officials, we are crisis managers. We have to be prepared every single moment of the day to deal with the unknown. This administration has no guardrails. They are off the rails, and they continue to push down their threats and intimidation. But again, secretaries are some of the strongest people in this country. We are on the front lines of this. I talk about Adrian Fontes in Arizona. He served 20 years, or he served in the Marines. My elections deputy here in Nevada served 20 years in the Marines. These individuals are ready to do what they need to do to protect the citizens in their states, to fight back, to push back, and to ensure that voters have access to the ballot box. And that's where voters can express their opinions about this failed leadership of this administration. America wants leaders. They want people who are going to give them a plan forward, but we need to stand up first and make sure that access remains available.
Secretary, I don't have much time left, but with the little time that I have, one of the election officials I was just talking to before we got on air, a Republican top election official, is worried that where this is ultimately headed is towards violence, given how much Trump is sowing doubt about the elections and trust in the elections. Are you concerned at all? Do you think that there could be violence?
Well, given my job as Secretary of State and every secretary around this country, it's our job to work with elected officials throughout our state, whether or not they're Democrats or Republicans. We have to build a coalition to stand up for our state. The Constitution is clear that states run elections. I am working constantly with our top state officials, both law enforcement, but also at the local level, working with our law enforcement at the local level, the local sheriffs, to understand it's our duty to protect our citizens, to protect our state, but also to protect our access to the ballot box. We are ready for whatever it comes at us. We will be prepared, and we will respond with leadership and pragmatic responses.
Nevada Secretary of State Cisco Aguilar, thank you for your time. Joining us now is MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard and MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin. Thanks to you both. So, Vaughn, I just want to get your reaction first to the secretary. He's saying that they will be looking to Mad Libs of legal filings in terms of where they have to respond to the administration, depending on the scenario and what the administration could do if they try to seize more control, that they're just dealing with this unknown world.
Right, that it's public officials like him that are going to be on the front lines of having to be ready for litigation. Not only litigation filed against them, but potentially litigation that they are going to have to engage with themselves. And as you said, it's not just Democratic state lawmakers. You're also looking at Republican lawmakers, Republican Secretary of States, Republican county officials. You know, this is a moment where there is a legal apparatus that is understood that is needed to be propped up, because lawsuits can come from an array of places. And it's important not just only to have the litigation move through, but also in order to stymie conspiracy theories or the belief among voters that the elections are not legitimate. And that type of conspiracy theory is what leads to violence, as we saw in the 2 months that followed the 2020 election and ultimately gave way to January 6th, in that election conspiracy theories, frivolous lawsuits, they can lead to more serious consequences. And so the fact that there is such a concerted effort on the part of public officials to be ready for litigation, not only incoming litigation, but also to file themselves, I think is important understanding of American elections this go around.
Lisa, when we talk about the scope of these lawsuits, as we stated, the administration has lost 18 times when it comes to trying to get their hands on voter data. They've lost 24 times total when it comes to all their efforts of trying to gain more control over elections. Can you just walk us through a bit what they're trying to get before the Supreme Court here?
Well, I think, Laura, if I understand your question correctly, what they're trying to get before the Supreme Court, I think, is their effort to get voter data in an attempt to really sort of limit who gets to vote in this upcoming election. And even more specifically, they are trying to allow the United States Postal Service, which has no role constitutionally or statutorily in the administration of elections, try to get the Postal Service to sort of be the arbiter of who is allowed to get a mail-in or absentee ballot. And that's because one of the president's executive orders says that the Postal Service should promulgate a regulation that says to states, you send us your lists 60 days before an election of everyone who's entitled to vote absentee or by mail-in ballot. and then we will only send ballots to those people. That obviously prevents states who want to do things on a later timetable from doing so, and also may effectively limit who gets a ballot in the first place. This is an attempt by the administration both to prevent people from lawfully voting, but also to sort of terrorize a larger population of people who could potentially vote in a mail-in or absentee format.
Vaughn, what is the president's end goal here? I mean, because, again, we talk so much about what is his message heading into the midterms? And right now, this is his message. This is what he's talking about.
He has used mail ballots repeatedly, to Lisa's example, as a cudgel to suggest that there is fraud in elections, right? You can use that undocumented immigrants are voting en masse. That conspiracy theory has not been proved despite 6 years of efforts, and even more than that, to be clear. That goes also back to 2016. They claim that he actually won by millions more because of undocumented people fraudulently voting. They haven't been able to prove that in the decade since he rose to power. But on the mail voting aspect of this, right, that's one area that they continue to flood the zone in on. And the idea, though, that somehow that they would be able to effectively, if the Supreme Court were to take this up, let's just say, and then grant the U.S. Postal Service the ability to cut off mail voting to states that do not comply with turning over their voter rolls to the federal government, the consequences would be massive, because it's not just an effect of the pandemic that people have turned to mail voting. There's mail voting in red states and red counties, places like Arizona, which we were just referencing. 75% of people use mail voting, including in the rural parts of the state. And so if they were to go that route, effectively, you are turning out a different part of the electorate in ways that Donald Trump thinks that would be beneficial to him. But there's not even necessarily evidence that that would be the case, but it would inhibit the voting process.
Yeah, with the little time we have left, Lisa, I just want to ask you, I mean, we're talking about one of the most litigious presidents in history. I mean, is this really about winning here? I tried to ask the secretary that, but is this about winning, or what do you think this is ultimately about?
I think it's about both, right? This is a president that is very much about the both and strategy and pursuing multiple means of getting to the same end. So nothing is sort of off the table for him. I think that they are both trying to win, but they are also trying to signal to states that aren't pushing back, that aren't litigating against them, this is what we want you to do. And I want to be really clear, to the extent that a lower court has enjoined the U.S. Postal Service from promulgating that rule about how the voting lists come back and forth, that doesn't apply to states that weren't part of the coalition of plaintiff states that sued. In other words, if you're in a state that has a Republican attorney general, your state may very well comply with this. They very well might send 60 days in advance of the election a list of people who are qualified to vote by mail or absentee. And if you're not on it, the Postal Service is going to say back to your state, these are the people who will send ballots for and nobody else. That means a bunch of people in states controlled by Republicans' attorney general, regardless of their party, are going to be impacted by this unless and until those states fight back.
Well, I know that all three of us are going to be closely tracking all of these actions by the president, by the administration, and how states respond. Lisa Rubin, thank you. Vaughn Hilliard, you're going to be staying with us. Up next, is the Trump administration engaging in socialism? Plus, Democratic socialists are having a moment, but could they turn it into a bid for the presidency? We're back in 90 seconds.
$30 construction projects launched that would never have been launched. So here's my view. I told you that I thought in the end of this year, we would get to 4% GDP growth. Fives. You're going to see fives in the greatest economy in the world. You're going to see fives. And people think you can't.
That was a big promise. 5% GDP growth sure is a lofty goal. But that's what our Commerce Secretary was promising back in January. A far cry from the latest report that shows our economy slowing. GDP in the second quarter was just 1.5%. Joining us, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Michigan, Justin Wolfers, and Vaughn Hilliard, my friend, is back with us. So, Professor Wolfers, to you first. So let's say President Trump didn't start the Iran war impacting GDP. Is there any way that we would have seen 5% or even 4% GDP at this point?
No, heck no, and definitely not. And it's not even in the range of arguable, right? We could say it was 1.5%. Maybe it could have been 2% if something else happened. Although something else didn't happen. Someone did start a trade war. Someone did blow out the budget deficit. Someone did start a war in Iran. But it was not credible when he said it. It was nonsense at the time. He possibly even knew it, or he'd been drinking a lot. But there's no question that this claim that they would supercharge American economic growth, the best thing you can say is this is a distinctly moderate period of economic growth. I actually think that's good, given all the mischief they've gotten up to, that the US economy managed to keep on keeping on at 1.5% is fantastic. 5%, a joke.
So Lutnick's promise, as Justin says, maybe would have never materialized. But you have the president over and over again, Vaughn, saying that the economy is great, that it's booming, that it's amazing, that he's fixed the economy, that that his predecessor left him. You know, that's not reality. So what exactly are you hearing from folks inside the White House or from other Republicans when it comes to how they're going to explain this to the American people?
Number one, they're putting less benchmarks down. It was not just Howard Lutnick, but Scott Bessent also was placing great expectations about what the impact of the tariff war initiated by the president would be 1 year ago. And what happens is when you lay down those benchmarks for a time period that is not the end of the administration, you are setting lofty expectations, not just for you and your own domestic policy agenda, but you're setting expectations for voters and for Americans that believe, a large part of the country believes, somebody that is their commerce secretary. And so when the positive effects that you predicted, like a 5% GDP growth, do not materialize, people start to question. And that's exactly what is being reflected inside of polling data. Because, folks, it's not just gas prices, energy prices, it's utility prices, it's home prices, mortgage rates. It is the reality that folks are still paying more. And it's so many of the promises that were not just on the campaign trail, but coming from this administration. And they said the impact of their policy would result in something that is not playing out here in real time. And that's a really tough thing to spin.
Yeah, I don't know how they plan on spending that, or if they maybe don't even plan on spending it very much, Vaughn. But I also want to ask about whether or not the Trump administration is engaged in socialism at this point, Justin, because Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary that we're talking about, he talked a big game in January, and now his department is announcing a new incentive program with $870 million in federal funds in exchange for minority equity stakes in 7 companies. So is this another example of socialism?
Laura, a long time ago, we used to begin our Economics 1 classes by defining capitalism and socialism, and then a mixed market economy, which is what the US is. We use markets and we also use government. And then I stopped teaching that because I thought everyone understood it and we didn't need to just repeat ourselves on pointless, mindless things. And then you add on, these things are more often thrown around as slogans than as anything else. So I'm going to use a different word just because socialism, communism, all that, there's so much baggage. The debate here is about how interventionist is the government. Historically, the Republican Party was the party of small government. It didn't want the government telling you or telling businesses what to do. This, though, is the most economically interventionist government of my lifetime, and I'm 53 years old. They are involved with telling you who you can trade with and at what rates. They're literally directly buying shares in particular businesses. The president calls companies and tells them how they should set their prices. He issues statements telling Intel to fire its CEO, and then the very next week invites the bloke in, and the bloke accidentally leaves 10% of his company down the back of the White House couch. This is not how America traditionally did business, but more to the point, it's not how the Republican Party traditionally did business. It is, in fact, the most interventionist government of my lifetime.
Vaughn, how do they explain how interventionist they are? All these national investments that the government is making?
They compare it to the CHIPS Act and that money that was provided to chip companies for AI or for chip investment, semiconductor investment in the U.S. Effectively, that there was nothing that was holding any of these companies and these corporations accountable. And this is the one way to ensure that by having the government have an official stake, that somehow that the companies are going to be more responsive to the administration and the government moving forward here. But you know, to Justin's point, I was actually over at the hotel where the CEO of Intel was staying after his Oval Office meeting. And at the time, he was moving with his scrum of folks. And I thought real fast, what question do I even ask him? The last question I would have had on my head is, what did you offer the president of the United States? And was it a 10% share of your company? And I appreciated also on that graphic that you just had up, Laura, the $28 billion to farmers, right? If his economic policy and agenda doesn't work, what he ends up doing is finding cash and a government stake and investment as an alternative route. You can tell farmers, you can tell the agricultural industry, don't worry about those losses. Sorry, this didn't work out. We're going to subsidize and make up for your losses. Right. It's also the same thing when you're making these sorts of investments in these companies here. You are suddenly taking a different ownership of the American economy in a way that may not be felt or completely understood in months' time, but has long-term consequences and impact that these types of investments in these companies, I don't think that we're even at on the cusp of beginning to understand what the impact long-term will be.
Yeah, it's all just stunning, potentially hypocritical, as the president has said over and over again, that he will not be engaged in socialism, that America is not a socialist country, and he attacks Democrats for it repeatedly. Justin Wolfers and Vaughn Hilliard, thank you. Up next, they've won state races. Could a Democratic socialist win the White House?